LOL. Welcome everyone to Arts Lunch. This is the last of February, and we're gonna go out with a fun one here with John Lee is going to talk a little bit about formation and a little bit more about the particular role of Audre Lorde and her work in formation at United, which was true of when I took formation, and that wasn't even with John, and it's been true for every semester since then. There's this continuous thread of all United students having to work with, for a couple years now, all United students having to work with Audre Lorde's essays, Audre Lorde's charges to how to live in this world. So without further ado, John, our own John.
It's good to be here. Thanks, Max. It's good to see everyone. Some folks I'm more familiar with, but it's others I've heard much about you all. I don't know what that means, but but clearly the company that you keep, I will extrapolate from there.
Thanks, John. So the way this will work today is I'll ask John a couple of questions about Audre Lorde and about formation for about 20 to 30 minutes, and then we'll just open it up to everyone for broader discussion. But to begin with, I was wondering, John, if you could talk about your role at United and what formation is.
Sure, that's a huge topic. Not my role, but at least what the hell formation is.
Yeah. And I have to, or less.
Yeah, and I have to say it that way. What the hell is formation? I am the assistant professor for spiritual formation and the director of formation for master's students here at United. Was chaplain before that for a number of years, and then took on the director of formation role about 3 years ago. And in my second year now as professor of spiritual formation. Formation, as it was conceived by both Greg Beeland and Sarah Wilhelm Garbers, was this essential aspect in terms of personal and spiritual formation, who you are, where you've come from, how you show up in the world, and all of those threads that continue to run through that are essential and fundamental to both your perspective of being in the world, and then consequently how you're going to be with other people as well. So this impacts, pretty much every damn thing. And for a large part of it, for me continuing in the same sense, a lot of what we get at is in terms of identity, how that shapes who we are, the lenses that we engage and interpret the world, and subsequently in terms of, as I keep impressing, and Fred, you're gonna hear this nonstop now, since you're in the semester of this, what are the invitations for us to grow and to change and evolve in the same way? How can we make meaningful, lasting change in the world, living out our purpose in the same way too? So that's a long explanation. There's a bunch of other stuff about wisdom and equanimity and knowing oneself, self-regulation, self-differentiation, but I'll get into that when we get into the qualities in particular. I'm hoping that's clear enough for folks.
Yeah, and I think going into the 6 key qualities would probably help. So what are the 6 key qualities? And then later we'll bring in how does Audre Lorde relate. But right now, just what are the 6 key qualities?
I'm going to ask the students who've taken the course. This is your pop quiz right now. If you can name them, there's not really a particular order, but you can name them in terms of how we've done them. And again, Fred might have a leg up because he's in the midst of it right now, but.
Do we have to name all of them, or can we
just name one? Yeah.
Emotional intelligence.
Humility. Moral imagination.
Generativity.
Moral, or did someone already say moral imagination? Yes.
It bears repeating.
Oh, that's okay. Then authentic spirituality. That was the other one.
Differentiation of self. I think that's the last one. I have the piece of paper that John gave me that says there's only 6.
Thank you. Yes, I'll put these in the chat for folks. Thank you. Everybody passes a gold star. Thank you very much. As I finish writing this real quick, let's see if I remember what they are, since we have class tonight in formation.
What are these, the 6 key qualities of what?
These are the 6 key qualities that we focus on in regards to their impact in spiritual leadership. And how that shows up, it actually might show up differently in regards to how they dance with each other, in regards to chaplaincy, social advocacy, social justice work, congregational ministry, and congregational ministry, and even in terms of scholarship, doing your PhD work, which I consider also spiritual leadership in the same sense too. How they dance with each other impacts, again, how we show up in the world, who we are, what has brought us to this place, and understanding that. I was tasked when I first began, this was kind of reductive, I don't necessarily agree with it, which is just make sure our students don't go out and cause harm. And I was like, I think we can do better than that. But that was one conversation around that, which is particularly around our students, which is like, yes, that's always a danger in that sense. But really in terms of growing into the fullness of who we are, these roles that we are being called to and that will change over time will pull on different threads of who we are. These qualities are not necessarily something to master. These really, what we're using them for is discernment points in terms of, again, just asking the question that I keep repeating over and over again, and that we keep answering throughout our lives. Who am I? What is my purpose? How then shall I live? So as we enter into this is something that's just deeply human. But my sincere feeling is that, particularly around spiritual leadership and all these different iterations, we're being invited to be deeply human in the fullest possible sense in that moment. So, so that's what we take in FO 1001, and what I'm doing with capstone folks at the end is to look at, we call it looking at the pastoral or prophetic more of a situation, using the 6 qualities to see what threads are there. These are usually these are many things that we don't actually think about or focus on particularly, and I don't see them as discrete. We're just pulling them apart as discrete for the time being, to allow us to have a lens and to examine and reflect on them. But when we get to capstone, reflecting on their own ministry and how that shows up in the same way. Max, your dad's asking me a question. Should I take it?
I would ignore it.
Is it a trap? Is it?
Well, we can, luckily this will record the question here in the chat. We can return to it a little later on. But I think where I'd like to move the conversation is now, why Audre Lorde? Why, if anyone who's taken formation at United in the last couple of years, you read quite a lot of Audre Lorde. It's almost like having her as a conversation partner throughout the whole semester. So why and how did that happen?
My understanding in terms of how Audre Lorde got on the formation, particularly FL 1001, was when Sarah was teaching with Io Yetunde, a former colleague who was the interreligious chaplaincy professor. Io is a huge scholar of Audre Lorde and her work, particularly the psychospiritual work that Audre Lorde does through her poetry as well as her essays. And it was pretty clear that it was like, yeah, this fierce human being is not only living through this, but is putting this out there specifically as invitations for each one of us. And her own sense of spirituality, of where Catholicism, being an immigrant as well, so some other roots of that, moving to the I Ching, which is a Chinese divination document that deals specifically with yin yang, and the basis of which is in Taoism specifically. And then moving to African spirituality, this sense of evolution of who she is, her art, her voice, that her life really chronicles this very well. And so it was placed on there as to engage how beautifully she is aware of her own inner landscape. And as for a lot of students, particularly here, understanding where she's speaking a lot of reality that sometimes we dare not speak, things that we have not put our lens on, feelings and impulses that we have possibly even shamed and said it has been told it's not okay to say these things or feel these things. Audrey's just going to feel them and is going to say them. And as she says, you know, there's no need or the effort to put pretense on this. But that's how Audrey got on there specifically. And how I have turned that a little bit is specifically asking questions around this in regards to people's own cultural, social, psychological, spiritual location, to see what's there. What is the invitation? And even hearing from folks where it's like, you know, well, Audrey's a Black lesbian womanist in the 60s. She wasn't really talking to me. And yeah, usually my response is like, oh, okay. But as many folks already know, it's like, she really is putting this invitation, not as a wagging finger of judgment, or as somebody who said that the presumption is, you know, from one person was that she was located within resentment and retribution, which I'm like, I don't know where we get that. But instead, her constant invitation of like, where else is your canvas located? What parts have you not explored yet? What is waiting for you that's there? Which I think is a beautiful invitation, and can hear the gentleness as well as the fierceness, which is a large reason why I think Audrey is specifically on there. Also, a lot of people don't know Audre Lorde's work. They might know her poetry, but they don't know her essays. And just a shameless plug, you know, in terms of what Justin, Gary, and the faculty are coming up with in terms of womanist theology course specifically to get more into this, because there are other voices here that also formation hits. But for my purposes, it's just a wonderful invitation in terms of into our own humanity, and to go deeper there.
Thanks, John. I think that thing about, like, you know, Black lesbian in the 60s, why does she have to say to us? And I laughed obviously when you said that, but part of it is because I feel like specifically at United she has a very particular voice. I mean, we are currently in the midst of changing curriculum to be more liberational, to include womanist and Black theologies, where you've been part of this. CARJ, the committee advocating racial justice, has been more active, and there's a way that so many of the essays in Sister Outsider are directed towards like white feminists, and I think a lot of people at United could be identified as white feminists. Not only we're diverse, but we also are very white, or have a white majority. So I'm curious how she speaks specifically to that context, because I feel like she has like we're even more particular, that sort of liberational, left-leaning, very white community in a lot of ways. Not to say that there aren't people here who aren't that, but that's part of our reality. How does she speak to that?
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
So I haven't been in one of these before. Do people just interject, or am I just pushy?
You can ask.
So like, I don't understand the whole concept of I am not a Black lesbian, therefore this person isn't speaking to me. Like, I don't, I guess that just doesn't make any sense to me at all. Is that from a place of you are different than me, therefore you can't teach me anything? Or is it that people read it and don't understand what she's talking about? Or could somebody just, I'm not trying to be funny, but could somebody just explain that to me?
Let me take a shot and let me have other students step in to that in particular, because that's a very rare expression. And this is also kind of points to why I feel like Audre Lorde's work is so pertinent right now. And my engagement with Lorde is around non-dualism, where it hits home very clearly, and also particularly around racial ethnic identity. Duality, as many of you know, keeps this sense of that things are separate, they're discrete from one another. And particularly Cartesian dualism, which separates the head from the rest of the body, makes it so that my experience is mine. I think, therefore I am. I'm taking that out of context in some ways, but the privileging of reason specifically. What we understand about the neuroscience behind how we engage reality is that there clearly is particularity and separation in terms of what our experiences are. But the reality, particularly within white supremacy, is that there is a division, that your experiences are yours, mine are mine. I can't speak to yours. Yours is a totally different thing than mine, as well as then you throw in white guilt, white fragility, where I don't want to appropriate. So you get caught in this bind of like, well, to be safe, which again is in terms of the normalcy of where we set delineations, to be safe then is, well, I'm just going to keep it at arm's length. As opposed to this sense of there's a reality and a story here that might not be ours from an external standpoint in terms of the ways that we divide and separate, but that clearly she's talking about what does it feel to be diminished, as Io says, to face annihilation. Both in a figurative sense, but also in a literal sense. And so the urge to keep her at arm's length is even that sense of like, again, a lot of folks are probably tired of hearing me say this, but what's the invitation here? And so that might be a separate reality from, what you experienced, Tara, as well as from me too. But that's the whole point in terms of when you're going into a congregation or you're going somewhere else, separateness will keep you safe, but it doesn't make you real and fully present, as well as just possibly somebody else's story that from external characteristics might seem very different than you, but as many of us know, actually has a lot more depth, and that we're intertwined much more finely, but then also much more powerfully in the same way. I want to geek out in terms of particularly the Chinese yin and yang, but the yin energy, some of you might understand that in terms of receiving energy, particularly within Chinese Taoism. It very much so in terms of, she calls it the dark mother in all of us. This energy, you can say, particularly within Ayurvedic perspective, yoga perspective, it's Shakti that lies at the base of our tailbone. It is this dark energy that is part of who we are, that she is finding these ties to and is welcoming us into this. But Cartesian dualism would like to separate that and keep that contained specifically. So That's a long answer, but also for me, it's not demonizing that standpoint. It's clearly the invitation to say, for many of us possibly, there are places within our own lived experience that have been deemed unsafe, and that we have naturally bought into what that story is. Audre Lorde is asking us, is it really unsafe? Or does it feel out of control? And clearly, is the holy the ineffable within that dark space? My answer would be yes. So that's what we're getting at, and it kind of gets revealed in this sense, and not to make light of that, but because clearly Audre Lorde has disrupted, using Gary's words, disrupted and disturbed parts of my understanding of who I am, and realizing it's like, oh, there's more here. There will always be more here. In that sense, I'm not sure if that's helpful or not, but
It is. And can I ask one more thing? And I swear I'm not going to take over this whole lunch. But do you think she was impactful or as appreciated while she was still here than she is now?
I'm not sure. Other people can answer. I can only answer for myself, in that when I was first exposed to Audre Lorde's poetry in undergrad, which I have no idea why a small university in the middle of Indiana would cover Audre Lorde, which to this day I'm still confounded by. Definitely not appreciated, and definitely fixated within identity politics at that time. And this was given by, a fairly liberal teacher who still, was keeping her in a box. My sense is, and I can just speak, again, I can only speak for myself. I don't think I appreciated her. Not that I grew up in the 60s and 70s, but only as a toddler and a young person. And even through college, I don't think I appreciated everything until started reading her more. And then Dr. Yuntunde, when I would geek out about particularly I Ching and Taoism. And there's a lot there that she is playing with in her teenage years specifically, but then how it impacts her work. So I would say, at least for me, yes, or not completely understood in that sense. I'm uncomfortable talking for a long time because I can just talk and talk and talk. So I appreciate folks throwing stuff in, as well as you all have read Audre. You all have read Audre, so it's enjoyable to hear where, as many of you have read your work in terms of engaging her, what comes up as you do as well. And even this lasting impact that she continues to unwind certain things as well too. But go ahead, Max, whatever you want to do.
Oh, well, I have a question that can be for you and also anyone who's been in the class or is currently in the class. And that's really, what are some key texts that you study that for you that really stand out, or for students that have been really impactful? I can already think of a couple that I've seen people respond to, like uses of the erotic or the letter to Mary Daly, that I've seen people reference outside of that class. So I'm curious, what are some of the Audre Lorde readings that are particularly impactful for you and for the class? And that can go to John or anyone.
Well, yeah, if anybody wants to answer that in particular, because you all have written extensively in terms of if there's something there, or if you're rereading her as well, and I can answer for me later.
As a non-traditional student in this seminary, I really appreciate and fall back on the invitation and permission that Lord gives to really stand in my own location and speak my own truth, even when it's not, that standard Christian line. And the thing I've noticed in terms of her work and her perspective is that it goes beyond the formation class. It comes up again in art. It comes up again in ethics. It comes up again in, sort of the, I'm doing Debian's What is Religion class, and certainly the, what is religious, what is spiritual, where are those lines? I think Audre Lorde sits right smack on that line in a lot of her work. So I think it's a really useful thing to study her in formation, because it just sort of, Audre Lorde ties it together in some ways.
Thanks, Lisa. Any other folks in, I know that there's people who are in it and people who have taken it. So any thoughts? Take information.
I just put a quote in there specifically.
Yeah.
Uses of anger, uses of the erotic, and I just speaking for other folks in terms of hearing, where particularly like in uses of anger, my silence has never served me. And she's talking about the silence in service to being safe, and particularly thinking about that line where she was mute for a number of years. But also in terms of being part of a non-dominant population to keep status quo and to keep things the way they should be, particularly when there's deep hurt and anger surfacing. These things, as I'd like to say, that our understanding or our belief about love has been violated in some way. For many folks, particularly at United, where there's quite a few folks who have experienced trauma in many senses. The permission giving, as Lisa says, as many folks have said too, that this has to, the invitation is for us to put this out, regardless, and in some ways, possibly in spite of whatever codification of interchange dialogue is imposed, that works to specifically silence, sideline, run over, as particularly as Kimberly Crenshaw in Intersectionality talks about these ways that we fall in the cracks. I can't think of a better text, especially as Lisa said, that an author who speaks to this population and truly from an embodied standpoint, holistically, that this is not just a head exercise. It's definitely not just an emotional exercise. This is asking all of us and all parts of ourselves to be here, including the parts that have been hurt, that are still wounded and still in need of healing. But to do the work in terms of liberation, both for ourselves and for others, they're inextricably tied together. And clearly this is her invitation. And this, I just put this quote up here because someone quoted me, who's not Black, not lesbian, cisgender male, who's like, so I can claim the Black mother inside of me. And I was like, please go ahead and do so, because it doesn't serve to cut that off. And consequently, I like the other quote that for leaks for me is where her daughter says, write something about how if you keep silent, you punch yourself in the mouth from the inside, that we do ourselves damage by holding down these places, these truths that we have experienced and lived. And in fact, they actually, they are liberative for others once we do so, but that's not the point of putting them out there in the first place.
I want to chime in and say that I, much like Lisa brought up, I think that John, like having those messages and Audre Lorde as like this canon across United students who go through that program has been like really powerful. Just to have this like shared wisdom to just within our other classes to be like, not the master's tools, and just be able to use these like this expansive knowledge and like refer to it in shorthand and be like, yep, I know what you're talking about. Oh yeah, that lesson. Sure. And I think that kind of like what Max was bringing up earlier, I personally found it really powerful, even though I had read some of these essays before, to encounter it in this context, specifically because United and I feel this in myself, represents this like ethos, or in some ways our culture is oriented and in this history and of white feminism. And I put in the chat that one of the essays that was most powerful for me to read in this class was Uses of the Erotic. And I think specifically because it talks about power and sources of wisdom within our own bodies, that is something that we all have, and we all have agency, and we also therefore all have responsibility. And I think as sometimes, one edge of white feminism is to orient around this sort of like fixing or savior reaction to oppression and violence. And so to know that I don't have to, I have my own source of like power and insight and spirituality, and joy and fulfillment. And I don't have to form my identity around being someone who is constantly talking about empowering other people. Like I have that myself, I guess. And so I find that as like, in terms of being kind of like a corrective isn't exactly the word I want, but as an important source of wisdom, I think for who we are as United. At least I can speak to that, how it's impacted me personally.
Thank you, Stephanie. I'm just going to put another quote in here as well for you all. I'm just like, I'm locating the ones specifically for me that are instrumental for me in terms of acknowledging the differences that I hold within my own lived experience. And specifically the promise of United, that there's not this sense of conformity in terms of a denomination, in terms of an agenda, an outcome that I must get to. And even the forms, particularly within Buddhism, we talk about all forms being empty or boundless, that this also holds the potential that in discernment of where you feel like you're being led and being in touch with your own Black mother within you, your own yin or Shakti. What does that look like? What possibly could it be? And that also that this will evolve and change forms, and much to the I Ching in terms of the movement of yin and yang and dancing together. For us, it's about being fully on the ride, and much to your point, Stephanie, in terms of both power, in terms of a rational, reasonable, grasping sense, but maybe even more so in terms of where Lorde is saying there's power in receiving. There's power in not being in the driver's seat and feeling where the waves and the flow move us as well. This is from Master's Tool. This is another famous essay that we talk about in class, but as far as the Master's Tools will never dismantle Master's House. I just invite you all to read this, but if you have a chance, not just stopping there, but some of her poetry is absolutely powerful. And also, I'm a little geeky in terms of, again, people have heard this already, the existential threat of non-being is a hobby for me. I don't know what that means, but clearly the sense of anxiety being tied to fear, and she gets at annihilation, Armageddon, so well. That is actually empowering for me, much like to the Eastern religions and also the Tillich, where it's like, it's taking this, not keeping it at arm's length, but finding the means to take it within us, even bit by bit, that then we realize that this is something that can't be taken from us, but to live into it even more so. And once you experience it, you can't unlive this, and you can't go back. This is all weird, cryptic, mystic stuff, but anyway, that's just my own crap.
Thanks, John. Weird, cryptic, mystic stuff. A companion to Audre Lorde is maybe the future. This quote is really good, and I was just wondering if someone wants to read this last quote that John posted in the chat out loud, so we can also hear Audre Lorde's words.
I can.
Great. Thanks.
Those of us who stand outside the circle of this society's definition of acceptable women, those of us who have been forged in the crucibles of difference, those of us who are poor, who are lesbians, who are Black, who are older, know that survival is not an academic skill. It is learning how to stand alone, unpopular and sometimes reviled, and how to make common cause with those others identified as outside the structures in order to define and seek a world in which we all can flourish. It is learning how to take our differences and make them strengths, for the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. They may allow us temporarily to beat him at his own game, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change. And this fact is only threatening to those women who still define the master's house as their only source of support.
Wow, that was amazing. Great reading of it and great original source material. What are people's responses to that? I'm still thinking of my response to that.
I put a question. I mean, how do you stand alone and make common cause? I love that statement but it seems like, how do you do both?
Can I take 2 hours to answer that one? I can bring in graphs and diagrams. But Jonathan, I think that's a great question. And for me specifically, the Eastern practices of non-dualism, and for her in terms of African spirituality, and Christian mysticism for that matter, this aspect of where I don't want to get into Buddhist texts too much, but specifically Dogen and Yohuna and some other Zen writers talk about the relative and the absolute exist together. But if we privilege simply the relative in order to stay safe and and what I'm hearing, particularly in Audrey's words here, just to survive, we know where we end up. We probably have seen ramifications of that throughout the rest of the world in terms of the autocrat looking for the strong man specifically, because we want certainty. But the absolute, which is bigger and specifically within, I'm trying to not get too much into technical languages, but cataphatic and apophatic practices. The apophatic, that which via negativa, words cannot describe this. This is the suchness that precedes the subject-object split. The more that we continue to hone into this allows us to both manifest both realms, because we are anyway right now. We are clearly engaged in both the relative and absolute. Our religious and spiritual traditions and practices get at this where it's not about explaining it through our words and through our head. It's about experiencing it through our lives. How do we continue to do this to continue to re-engage both the movement of both, and also realize that there are times where our truth, maybe it's to Tara's point as well, maybe it's not understood yet, because it's something that words can't really capture. But as you all have heard me say in terms of jazz being my metaphor, sometimes it's more feeling than it is conceptual grasping. You can't fake the funk. It's there or it's not. So how do we continue to feel the funk with each other? And particularly this space where it's like discursion is definitely prized. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. It's helpful to give us analysis. The hermeneutic of suspicion is very clear. It's helpful. But this other aspect in terms of standing together is this sense of interconnectedness and inner being that points more to a sense of hermeneutic of wonder, of curiosity, that must stand alongside that of suspicion as well. I don't know if that's helpful or not. I can go into huge long practices in terms of sitting practices and everything else, but probably is not the point. But yeah, there's a lot there in terms of to unpack that and how do you live that.
John, thanks for that. I think that is helpful because I think it does point. What I was been hearing about is, embodiment practice of getting into, if I can't do my own work in my own body and whatever, I can say maybe a wonderful lot of things, but my heart, so I say one thing, but my heart is really connected to my body, of course, but there's some kind of stuff in my body that's been in the terms of maybe racism or other trauma things in my body. So I think maybe the standing alone is we all have our work to do, our embodiment practice work to do. And then maybe then I can show up in a way that is actually genuine for somebody else, instead of just kind of saying what we want to, what we want to hear, what they want to hear, but then do they really feel safe, or they say the same thing back. I want to, they know what to say, whoever that is, who doesn't feel safe. And so, I think we need to stand alone and do our own body embodiment work.
Yeah, thank you, Donald. There's a lot there in terms of the symbol that I have on my screen. It's an enzo in Japanese, is wuji in Chinese, which is the circle, and it's like completeness, unity, the undivided whole, non-duality, all these other things, yada yada. But it literally it's a signifier in terms of letting our mind not be extinguished, but letting our mind settle so that our body can take its rightful place with it. And then in that sense, when they're both, there's too many thoughts coming to my head, when they're both in that place as opposed to one driving the bus constantly, then for us experiencing that sense of the ineffable, of the transcendent. So there's so much in there, and also doing it within community, doing it with in the presence of other people, so that we're, again, I'm using my analogies that you've heard before, so that we are quite honestly clearing the loading docks so that we receive the important shipment that's there. And that's just an embodied practice done in community together.
I love that because of the messiness, I think, that could be created, and can the community contain that? Can it be within and really, like for instance, United can United be there in all the messiness that comes up in the embodiment practice work? So not doing it in in separation from, but in a community that somehow gets it and that can roll with the messiness that comes up from such work, that can transcend then out into the outer world.
Yeah, thank you, Donald. Max, are we gonna be in trouble because we didn't answer your dad's first question?
I mean, we can answer that, I guess.
Could I say something about that?
Yeah.
Let me go back and look at the question. How do we stand alone, unpopular, and make common? I think part of what that is, standing alone might be being the first person to say it out loud. So it isn't that other people don't necessarily agree with you. Either they're afraid to say something or they don't know how to say it. But just because I don't think that stops it from being a common cause. I think you might be the one to go, whoa, hey, wait a minute. What about this, this, and this? And other people might be like, oh, yeah. And then you create the cause around that. And I think she's talking about where she talks about the master's house. So I think what we're bumping up against is the master's house, which benefits the master, but it doesn't benefit the rest of us. So I think it's about having the nerve to say no, and then sometimes you're reviled for it, but then sometimes you're blessed by it as well.
Wonderful insight. Thank you, Tara.
Yeah, I really agree and think about the master's house, and I guess one of the ways I read the Lord quote is standing alone and common cause is we all might work to dismantle the master's house. That doesn't mean we all do it from the same place. We don't do it from the same perspective. One of the most, for me, impactful Lord texts is the letter she wrote to Mary Daly after Mary Daly published Ecology, which looked at this sort of history of trying to reclaim a sort of goddess figure and women's history, but in a way that completely neglected Black women or only framed them as victims of misogyny and not as a source of power. And then also in my own work with gynecology, completely demonizes trans women and trans people. And so what I really appreciate about Lord's letter to Daly, which is all around like, I want to connect with you. We're both lesbian feminists. We're both part of this movement, and yet you have no space for me and my truth. How can we possibly work together? But not in a completely rhetorical sense. It's not completely like, how can we possibly work together? We can't. There's an attempt to work. Sorry, I'm just responding to Melissa with grunts and anger. But there's an attempt from Lord to actually have a conversation, and as the history, no, don't apologize.
No.
Part of, I'm all for exposing Mary Daly's things that people, yeah, whatever. Because we have to read her too, often. But there's an actual attempt to work with her and to talk with her, and eventually there was actually a response that Mary Daly took a really long time to send back, and some people are like, it's not a great response, but I find that helpful because I work with feminist theory, feminist history a lot, and I'm talking across the lines, including with conversation partners who might be more on that like exclusionary side, or who, if not outright, are at least influenced by Mary Daly. And so I think it's really helpful to have Audre Lorde's example of how to talk across difference, how to not budge when you've been wronged and left out, but also be like, that doesn't mean we get to not work on this together. Like, that doesn't mean this is the end point. It doesn't get to be on you, Mary Daly's exclusionary terms, that I'm not part of the conversation anymore. So I find that really helpful. And I see that as almost an example of, these are both women who have been on their own historically, both Mary Daly and Audre Lorde. And I don't think they particularly ended up together, but I think that the example from Audre Lorde, for instance, is a really important one across generations of how to engage being alone and also being together. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's some of what I'm thinking about. other thoughts?
Just real quick in terms of answering Jonathan, in terms of authentic spirituality, it's you who decides what is authentic spirituality. It's you who decides that you're not performing for somebody else. It's you who decides in terms of what is the unity of being and meaning in this practice. That's not done for status, security, but grounds you into both this reality and also into an expansive sense of relationship with the world around you too.
That seems to be a great connection to Audre Lorde, because the powers, it's you recognize your own power. It's not well. There's not much more to add to that.
That's a wonderful question, though. I just don't want to get Max in trouble, so I just want to answer that one.
No, you wouldn't get me in trouble. Max correctly dismissed my question. It was off track.
Yes. My authentic spirituality is being dismissive. Just kidding.
Of certain people.
Kind of. Are there any last questions for John, for each other? Comments? Doesn't have to be a question with some of what we've talked about today.
John, I'm curious, you kind of talked about it in terms of accompanying and sort of facilitating other people's formation process, but I'm curious about how Audre Lorde's work has maybe transformed you and just being with it for so long with so many people. I imagine that it's also like having that kind of generative effect. And if you're willing to speak to it, also how it's leaked into, hopefully, your work in United at large. So as, in working with the changes and responding to things, working with other faculty and staff, like kind of that level of our community.
Yeah, that's a big question. Thanks, Stephanie. I don't think it's going to end in terms of the changes of what's there. I can tell you this, and this kind of mirrors in terms of my experience growing up in Indiana, and if it makes sense at all, I had a lot of Black aunties growing up who would kick my ass and yet be a warm, receptive place when my Chinese aunties didn't understand that there is this other part of me where it's like, this doesn't fit anywhere in terms of these cultural norms. Even Audrey's engagement with the I Ching allowed me to see, and still allows me to see, another part of particularly Taoism, cosmologically, where I'm grounded, but also because it's a different voice, and it's not appropriation, because it's like, of course, anybody uses this. It's like, whatever, it's not Chinese. There is no origin here. It just is existence. She allows me to speak into that, where, particularly from a cultural standpoint, that Chinese culture has distorted the ineffable as well for its own purposes. And so then it's like, oh, okay. Particularly that sense of right before that quote in terms of embracing our differences. It very clearly for me, much like with her, and it's not necessarily everybody has to do this, but that I consider myself a multiple belonger in terms of religious identity. And it's complicated. She continues to push on that for me, both in terms of external sense of what it means to belong, and much to Jonathan's question of both standing alone and being in solidarity with others who are standing outside the circle, as well as the next aspect, which she doesn't say in this quote, but those who feel like they are in the center and are protective of that status, the reality is they're actually standing outside of a circle also. And that's, so these sages, which I particularly think Audrey is for me, these sages welcome me into understanding and engaging reality in a different way, and turning that. And so even when I recite the Bodhisattva vows when I'm sitting, or doing the loving kindness, the metta, when I say particularly somebody that I have difficult emotions with, much to your point too, Max, in terms of Mary Daly or my Mary Dailies, in this sense, my connection is that I do want them to be free from their suffering, that I do want them to be the fullest expression of who they are and the particularity that they have been made into, and that as such, I need to do the same for myself. This is my hope. You know, with our colleagues, we've just been putting out fires left and right, so we haven't really got into this stuff where it's like, this is actually the stuff that matters to me, as well as each one of your all's journey is really what matters to me. I don't really give a shit about whether the institution survives or not. I do give a shit about what you all are going to do with this. For you to be connected to the Dark Mother, to Shakti, to Yin, and that compassion and wisdom, equanimity, and mudita, sympathetic joy, be manifest in wherever you are. That's really what matters. So my hope is for us as faculty that's what we are about, because I ain't performing for anybody. Again, I don't really give a shit. And I'd rather us focus on this because I feel like this is our identity of who we are, who United has been for the longest time. We just said it in different ways. So I don't know if it makes sense or not. That's long, rambling stuff, getting on my soapbox. But yeah, there's, you know, we all don't have that much time. Let's just get on with it, and let's be about this, both in our scholarship, but maybe even more so how we are with each other.
Wow, thanks, John. And it's a great soapbox, so no apologies needed. Thanks so much for your time with us today. Thanks so much for everyone's questions and the chat and all of that. Next week is hybrid week. We still have arts lunch. I'll be doing a part 2 on theopoetics. This time will be about my work in drag theopoetics. And then we have new different guest speakers through May. There will be Stephanie will present on Homa of Klimt, Allison Jones on Kate Bush. These are part of our Women's History Month offerings in March. And then we'll have some stuff on movies and films. So there's a lot to look forward to. We meet every Tuesday at the same Zoom at 12 Central, 1 Eastern, etc.
One more thing, Max, too, about hybrid week is that we're doing a storytelling hour/workshop kind of thing Friday night. I think we said 7 o'clock Central Time on this Zoom and password. And we did a storytelling, like kind of a moth-esque storytelling session in the fall semester during hybrid week. That was awesome, led by Elena Hoffman. And this time around, we're stipulating that you don't have to have a story in advance prepared, which is how we structured it last time. This time you can come with no story ready. We'll talk about storytelling as a process and then have some opportunity to like kind of try working on a story during the session and then sharing what we've come up with. So it's much more of like a working session this time.
Great.
Thank you all for having me. It's wonderful to see you all.
Thanks
Be
so much.
well. Be well.
Well,
For you.
Thank you, John.
do we need to check in on anything?
Yes.